This episode, we can live with regrets. The ride's not over yet. Welcome back to Growing Up Punk, the podcast about punk rock and all of its friends. We are continuing our look at record labels that influenced us, record labels that we loved growing up. And this time, Aaron's sitting down with Tim Rogner of the band Allister. Now, Tim holds a pretty unique spot in this series because his band Allister was actually one of the first bands to be signed to Drive-Thru Records and to release an album on Drive-Thru. So he kind of has been there for the whole thing. He's seen the whole ride. So they talk about that. They talk about what it was like to be on that label in the early days, and also kind of that swing that happened, that boom, that growth that happened in the early 2000s. So they talk about what that ride was like. And of course, Tim, I should say, shares his 5 favorite releases from Drive-Thru Records as well. So before we get into it, let's get the housekeeping out of the way. Go follow us on Instagram, on Twitter, at Growing Punk Pod. You'll find our personal Instagrams and Twitters there as well. You can find us at growingpunkpod.com. We've got merch there. We've got our Patreon there. If you just want to be a monthly supporter, we've also got some blogs and reviews that we write from time to time. And of course, we're on YouTube and all your favorite podcast apps. Wherever you're listening or watching this, make sure you rate, review, subscribe, all that kind of good stuff. Tell your friends about the show. Let's not waste any more time, though. It's Aaron sitting down with Tim Rogner of Allister, sharing his 5 favorite Drive-Thru Records releases.
Drive-Thru Records was a California-based independent record label owned by Richard and Stephanie. The label was partially responsible for popularizing the pop-punk emo sound of the early to mid-2000s. So normally when I have bands on, I kind of ask, how did you first come to hear of this label, or, what was the first release? But you guys Allister was one of the first bands that signed to Drive-Thru, is that correct?
Yeah, I think, I think Drive-Thru numbered their releases, and I think we had the number 6 release.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So yeah, we were definitely one of the first bands.
So how did that kind of take us through kind of what was happening in the music scene at that time? What was Allister, doing at that point when you signed to Drive-Thru? A lot of the kind of hit releases, so to speak, weren't released yet. So what was, what attracted you to the label and kind of all that stuff?
Yeah, it was actually almost on a whim that we kind of got in contact with Drive-Thru. We had been playing around the Chicagoland area for about 2 years or so, and playing, in some of the surrounding states at small shows in Indiana and Wisconsin, Milwaukee and St. Louis, basically anywhere and everywhere that we could. And we recorded a demo tape ourselves just in the basement of my parents' house. And we were selling it at our shows, and we were like, well, why don't we just send this to some record labels? And we're like, okay, that sounds like a good idea. I wasn't really in charge of doing that. It was our other guitar player, John, at the time. And he had known a lot of different record labels. That's kind of what he was into. And so he looked up a whole bunch of addresses for record labels and stuff, and just started sending our demo tape out. And we probably sent out, 15, 16, 17. And one of the ones that he sent out happened to be to Drive-Thru. And Drive-Thru happened to be one of the only labels that actually responded and wrote us a letter back. There was one other label that did as well, and I don't remember who they were right now. But we got this letter from Drive-Thru in the mail, and it said, hey, we're kind of a small up-and-coming label. We really like your sound, but we want to hear a little bit more from you guys. And we were like, wow, this is really encouraging. A label actually has some interest in us. They didn't want us to sign any contracts just yet. But they were definitely interested in our music, and we thought that was really cool. Fortunately enough for us, we had already planned on recording a 7-inch ourselves, in a real studio with a real engineer. And so we went ahead and we did that, and we released it ourselves. It was a 7-inch called You Can't Do That on Vinyl. And so we sent a copy to Drive-Thru, and they were like, we really like this. We want to help you guys put this out. And so that's where the relationship between us and Drive-Thru kind of started. So we pressed I think by ourselves as a band, I think we pressed like 500 copies of that 7-inch, and we started selling them at our shows. And then after we sent it to Drive-Thru, they were, they wanted to do kind of like a distribution deal with us and help us sell that record and press some more, and then wanted us to do a full length record. So they repressed that 7-inch. I think they pressed like 1,000. So I think there's only like 1,500 copies of that record in print right now. And then things just kind of went from there. So that was Drive-Thru's number 6 release, was that 7-inch.
Yeah.
And then I think it was a year later, maybe a year and a half later, was when we actually recorded our full length record.
And so at that point, was it still a pretty small label when you guys did that first album? Like, were things like, what was the kind of the gradual, climb of that label, like with your band, kind of how did you see that shifting, or at what point, was it shifting?
Yeah. So we, when we signed on to do that first record, we didn't really know any of the bands on Drive-Thru. And then I think it was the summer of 1998, the RX Bandits went on tour, and they came and they played at a record shop like in our town, and we opened, and so we got to meet them, and they were just the coolest guys. They were just the nicest people, and we were like, wow, we're gonna be like label mates. We're recording a record with Drive-Thru. So it was cool to kind of meet other people on the label. So we got to meet them. They were the first band on Drive-Thru that we actually met. And they had a record out on Drive-Thru. I think they had like the number 4 release or something like that. Their first record. Drive-Thru had another band called Cousin Oliver at the time. That was kind of a ska punk band. They had another band called Unleaded Plus that I think maybe put out an EP and then disbanded, or maybe they put out one record and then disbanded. We never actually got to meet them. And then when we did our first record, there was a band called Mother Mania that Drive-Thru had just signed as well. So those were the first kind of 5-ish bands. And RX Bandits were the ones we got to know the best.
Yeah, I don't really recognize any of those bands. What's been interesting is as we're going through each label, I go on Wikipedia, I look at the discography, and it's amazing with some of these labels that it's like, oh yeah, I listen to all these bands, and I look through and it's like, oh, okay, there's a handful, with most labels that, some of the earlier ones, maybe some of the ones that, didn't get as popular or whatever. And so that's cool. You kind of came up with that. And so was Allister kind of one of the only ones, I guess RX Bandits as well, out of those that kind of kept going with the label? I don't recognize the rest of those kind of putting up.
Yeah,
more.
I think out of those, the first 5 or 6 bands that signed, we had some pretty good longevity. I think they signed River Phoenix too. Well, at the time they were called River Phoenix,
right?
And then they changed their name to Phoenix TX. But they were signed, I think, maybe right before us or right around the same time. But you'll have to forgive me, my memory is a little hazy. I don't remember exactly what happened. But they put out a record, and then I think they broke up for a little while, like 2 years, and then they kind of went on to do some other things. But then they got back together, I think, and maybe released another record on Drive-Thru. I don't remember exactly how it went, but I know during the first 2 years that we were on Drive-Thru, or maybe middle couple years, I don't remember Phoenix TX doing a whole lot, or River Phoenix doing a whole lot. So I think something happened with them in the middle.
Right. Well, then they kind of jumped to a major MC or something for their first full length, and
yeah, it was something like that.
Yeah. So what was it like growing with a label that, that grew so much from you guys signing to, whatever it was that you guys ended? Like there was, so much like crazy stuff was happening there. What was that like being a part of a label that was, such a staple of the scene, and, so many bands were blowing up?
Yeah, it was really weird. Because honestly, like we didn't realize it, like we didn't fully appreciate what was happening, because I think we were in the middle of it. And like, we were the type of band, and maybe this is just our personalities. Like we had virtually no interest in like fame. We had no interest in like getting big. We had no interest in like, selling tons and tons of records. We just liked going out and playing, punk rock. And so we didn't really come at it from that angle. And then we started to see some of these bands at Drive-Thru sign get bigger and bigger and bigger. And for us, it was like, well, this is pretty cool. Like, we're just kind of along for this ride. This is like just going to help us out a lot. And we felt like we didn't necessarily have to compromise a lot of the musical whatever musical integrity we thought we had, at the time.
Yeah.
So I think for us, it was fun watching it happen all around us, and kind of seeing a lot of these other bands get a lot bigger than we did. It was pretty cool, but we also saw it at our shows that how we were kind of the benefactors of that,
Right.
how more and more kids started kind of showing up at our shows too. So it was cool. I mean, it was definitely interesting, but it wasn't really something that we were cognizant of at the time. I don't think it was until after the last record that we did with Drive-Thru, when that record came out, we kind of had to take a step back and be like, Jesus, this label's pretty fucking big. Like, there's a lot of really big bands on this record label now.
Yeah,
So,
was it one of those situations where, maybe you were opening for a band that was bigger than you, but they were a lot newer than you? Like, did that cause any kind of like tension, or was it like you said, you were just kind of happy to play regardless of, how much time you'd put in or whatever?
I think human nature is to be slightly jealous of other bands that get more popular than you, sometimes. But it never we never let that really bother us, again, because we didn't really care that much.
Yeah.
Like, in our minds, it was like, well, it would be awesome if we were playing to 2,000 people like Newfound Glory too. But why are we going to get pissed about that?
Right.
Like, that seemed kind of a ridiculous thing for us to be upset about. But it was interesting at the beginning, taking Newfound Glory on the road with us and having them open some of our shows, or like Midtown opening a couple of our shows, or the Starting Line opened some of our shows, or, the Early November opening our shows. Finch opened one of our headlining shows in California. Like, a lot of these bands opened for us at some point. We took Fall Out Boy, not that they're on Drive-Thru, but we took Fall Out Boy on their very first tour ever.
Wow.
And spent, like 3 weeks on the road with those guys, and, super cool. And now they're gigantic,
Yeah.
So it was strange a little bit seeing all these bands get really popular. And like I said, I think there was maybe a twinge of jealousy here and there, just more so from the standpoint, like, is it going to be our turn? Like, are we ever going to, achieve that level where we can consistently sell out, 1,000 capacity venues or 2,000 capacity venues, or whatever the case is. But it didn't hinder us from making the music that we wanted to write, or playing the shows that we wanted to play, or doing things the way that we wanted to kind of do them.
Yeah. And did you ever feel like pressure, like from a label, or, I mean, like you said, you kept making the music you wanted to, but was there ever, conversations of like, well, maybe if we, this seems to be working for this band, like what if we kind of added some of that in, or was that too kind of copycat thinking, and you were, straight enough to just do what you were going to do, and, if it worked, great. If not, at least you were still happy with the music you were making.
Yeah, that's primarily how it was. We were happy with the music that we were making. The record label was happy with the music that we were making. I can remember, I think, one conversation, maybe two conversations, where they suggested that we rewrite a part of a song, or we tweak a part here or tweak a part there. But it was just a passing kind of thought. They let us have pretty much full control over, what we wanted to do. I think as a band internally for us was where some of the conflict, or the majority of the conflict, came from. Not that there was a lot, but the conflict that we did have came internally from the band, because we did kind of grow up on that old school punk rock ethos,
Yeah.
Everything's DIY. You just set up in a garage or in a bar or in a bathroom, and you just play, and you turn up loud, and you give it 120%, and you just get drunk and have fun. As we got older and as we started touring more, some of us wanted to experiment a little more with the dynamics of the band. Like, how can we expand our musical variety? Like, should we add pianos here? Should we add synthesizers? Should we add pedals, like different sort of tones, like delay pedals? Like, what do we do? Should we incorporate into that stuff to make our music a little bit different? And there were some arguments here and there, but nothing that really ever set us back. And I think all four of us are still really happy with every single thing that we put out the way that we wanted to do it.
Yeah, well, I think that's the most important thing. Like in that moment, I could see how there would be that temptation to, maybe try this or that. But now that time has passed and you can look back, right, it's better to be happy with what you did because you stuck to your guns instead of maybe branching off trying to see if that would help popularity, but then looking back and be like, oh, that was stupid. Why did we do that? So, and then I mean, the music scene is such a, like, luck draw of the card, right? Like, even if you tried doing that, it doesn't mean it was going to work for you just because it worked for another band. Like, there's so many things that go into it, and so it is always good to hear when a band is, even if they don't really know it in the moment, that they can kind of work past that and just keep doing what they're passionate about doing in the first place.
Yeah, and I think I think of a lot of bands, just any band's success in general comes from being honest, and being who they are. You, as a musician, it's fun to experiment and try new things, but also I think you want to be honest with yourself and create the music that you're capable of creating, and not make it so obvious that you're trying to step so far out of your zone. Right. That it sounds fake now, like, I think if Allister tried to make a record that sounded like Finch, it would be disastrous. It wouldn't, it would just be ridiculous. It wouldn't sound like us, even though Finch was an enormously popular band and they had a lot of popular songs and that style was really popular for a while.
Yeah.
If Allister tried to do that, it would sound utterly ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, it's good to know that before doing something, because that can just be kind of a train wreck, and then you kind of work yourself into a hole. But yeah, well, let's get into some of these records from Drive-Thru that you picked. So I asked you to pick kind of 5 favorites or 5 that stand out, and there's a few in here that I'm very familiar with and a few that I'm not so much, and so I like that about this. It kind of gives me an opportunity to learn about some bands as well. So the first one we're going to touch on is a band called the Benjamins and their album The Art of Disappointment, which was released in February 2001. So this is one of those bands that when I looked at your list, I was like, the Benjamins? I don't think I've ever heard of that band before. So I went back and tried to look up some stuff about them, and there's not a whole lot of information out there on them. So what can you tell me about this band and album and why it's a standout for you?
The Benjamins were a band from Milwaukee that signed to Drive-Thru not too long after us. We put out our record. We put out our very first record. Allister put out our very first record called Dead Ends and Girlfriends. And we toured on that record for about a year and a half. And as on one of the last tours that we did for that record, probably in 2001, just before the Benjamins record came out, we took the Benjamins on tour with us because they had just signed with Drive-Thru, and we were booking a tour at the time, and Drive-Thru asked us, hey, can you guys take this band along with you guys? They're a brand new band that we just signed. And we're like, yeah, like we'd heard a couple of their songs and we thought they were pretty cool. And we're like, yeah, let's do it. And so we toured with those guys for about a month. And from what I remember, it was pretty, I think it was a full nationwide tour. If not, it was at least in the Midwest and on the West Coast. But we were gone for a while. And it was like one of the funnest tours I've ever done. Like those guys are absolutely amazing. Like everybody in the band, it was just so much fun. And we were all fairly new to touring. Like Allister had done a couple tours, 2 or 3. And I think maybe the Benjamins had done 1. So it was all kind of new and exciting for us. And so we were all kind of experiencing this whole record label touring life together. And so we became really good friends with those guys. And then their record came out, and we actually got to visit them in the recording studio in Hollywood when they were recording that record. And it's one of my favorite Drive-Thru releases. Like everything on that record is great from start to finish. Like it's super catchy. It sounds great, but there's an element of rawness that's I think kind of comes out with it too. Jay was a great lyricist, so there's a lot of really good lyrics in there. I know he takes a lot from Dr. Frank from the Mr. T Experience. They're big Weezer fans, so you can hear those influences come through too. It's just there's not a bad song on that record. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I definitely enjoyed listening through it last week. It was different than I expected it was going to be, and kind of took some time to kind of think on the songs, but yeah, a pretty unique release. Did they do anything after that, or do you know?
No, they broke up probably a year after that record came out.
Okay.
And went on. A couple of the guys went on to play in some other bands. I know the drummer John played in a band called Limbeck for a while. And then he played in this other band called the Obsoletes, which is another one of my favorite bands. They're kind of like a Tom Petty type band.
Okay.
If you get a chance, check it out. It's fucking ridiculously good. It's so good. But I don't know what the other guys are doing right now.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, well, let's move on. Well, now we're going to talk about Finch, What It Is to Burn, which was released on March 12th, 2002. So this is one of the ones that I'm a lot more familiar with. This one definitely made it to the small town I was in at the time. And yeah, I mean, at this time, bands like Finch and The Used, where there was more kind of a screaming element where, that was blowing up at the time. And so what can you tell me about Finch and this album and any experiences you had playing shows with them during this time?
Finch was one of those bands for me that was able to, they were kind of a bridge for me. I don't really like hardcore too much, and I don't necessarily like screamo, or if that's the label you want to put on it.
Right.
I'm not a huge fan of that, but Finch was kind of that bridge for me. They were able to put together a record in such a way that it was both kind of pop, like had a lot of really catchy elements with what I think of as like good quality screaming. Like it's not screaming just to scream. It's actually well thought out, and it's structured well in the song. And again, there's maybe one song on that record that I tend to skip over, but there's some just crushers on that song, like songs that are so big and so good that you have to listen to them over and over again, because the hooks are just so big and they're so good. And that's what I like. Like that's the type of music that I gravitate to, is like pop songs with huge catchy hooks.
Yeah.
Like that's my favorite type of music. So Finch was able to kind of be that bridge for me, which is why I like him so much.
Yeah, I was listening through that one last week, and yeah, I'm just always when I put it on, there's the standout tracks, and then there's other ones that come on. It's like, oh man, I forgot about this song. Like, it's just such a great album. And I definitely was a bit disappointed that their follow-up was quite a bit different. That's I get that bands want to change and evolve, and I remember reading some articles how some of the band members just didn't want to do What It Is to Burn Part 2. And what's your thought kind of when a band, especially like this, where they were almost kind of a part of defining a certain genre or part of the scene, and then the follow-up is quite different, not necessarily drastically different, but was quite different. Is that something that kind of throws you off, or as a musician are you kind of all four bands just doing whatever they need to do to be creative?
I think it's kind of a fine line. I think I'm all for musicians experimenting, and trying new things. And I get that the guys in the band, were kind of like, we don't want to just make What It Is to Burn Part 2. We want to do something different, because as a musician, that's what you want to do. You want to push yourself. You want to expand your capabilities. You want to try new things. I think that what happened with Finch is that their record was so good, they didn't have enough time to really sit in that moment, right, with their fans. I think had they put out one more record that was closer to What It Is to Burn, and then put out, well, I forget, what was it called?
Like Hello Sunshine or something?
Hello Sunshine, yeah. I think had they put out a record after What It Is to Burn that was closer sounding to that record, and then put out Hello Sunshine, I think it would have been a little bit more well received, because they more likely would have gradually morphed into that sound, and and fans can morph with the band. It wouldn't have been such a drastic change, because I think people generally are adverse to change, when it's just smashed right in front of their face. Their initial reaction is like, what the fuck is this? Like, this is weird. I don't like it. Yeah. Without having sat on it for a little while.
Yeah. Did you... Sorry, go ahead, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I actually listened to Hello Sunshine fairly recently, like maybe a month or two ago. And I do like it. I don't love it, but I do like it. There's some good songs in there, and there's some interesting parts to a lot of those songs, which is what they were going for, which is why I'm happy for them. I think that's cool when bands can do that. Yeah.
Did you have like any experiences with them on this tour or this album tour cycle? And did you notice, a shift in kind of how it was received or the shows?
Not on Hello Sunshine. We really only toured with them when they were doing What It Is to Burn.
Okay.
And we kind of watched them. I'll never forget at it might have been their record release show, or maybe it was our record release show. I don't know. We were playing with them at some point. There was this club in Orange County called Chain Reaction, and I'll never forget, like, they showed up like in a minivan, and they were just like pulling like gear out of the minivan, like guitars with like no cases, like just snare drums, like sticks were laying around, like, it was just like the most haphazard shit of all time. And I was like, what, who is this band? Like, these guys just signed with Drive-Thru. Like, okay, I'm sure they're going to be good. And then they played and it was awesome. I was like, well, this is really cool. But it was just funny thinking back to like that first time I saw them and how they loaded in, and just like the whole vibe behind it. And then seeing how big they got, and seeing how good their record was. Yeah. It's cool to see that. Like, I like that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's cool to see the progress of a band, and to kind of be there in the moment too is something special. Mm-hmm. So the next one up is RX Bandits Progress, which was released on July 17th, 2001. This is one I'm not as familiar with. What can you tell me about this album and why it stands out to you?
So Progress, I believe, was the RX Bandits' second album. And I'm trying to remember. No, I believe it was their third album. Because I think halfway between here and there was their second album. So Progress was their third album. What I like so much about this record is that this is when the RX Bandits really started to kind of come into their own. It's where they really dove headfirst into talking about politics. They started writing songs that weren't just really like ska songs.
Yeah.
They were diverse musically, and they really started showing their musicianship on this record. Which, have you seen them live before?
No, I haven't.
They are like, it's not even close. It's not even close. The RX Bandits are far and away the best musicians that were ever on Drive-Thru.
Wow.
And the best musicians, in my opinion, to ever put out a record on Drive-Thru. Just their grasp of music is phenomenal. And the stuff that they can do really started to take shape on that record, Progress. They didn't get all the way there. I think they got all the way there on the record after that, which I think is called The Resignation. But Progress is where they first started showing those signs and proving how good they actually really were. And it blows my mind, like just seeing what they do now and like all of the musical stuff that they do right now. It's not, the music that they made wasn't always necessarily like my favorite go-to, but it was always the band that I appreciated the most and had by far the most respect for on the record label, because of the way that they approached what they did, in the way that they went about their business, and just the music that they put out. I like it a lot. I really do.
Well, and there's something special about knowing those things. Like when you spend time with a band that, for a listener that just puts on an album, you're not necessarily it's not gonna come through that like, oh, these guys are, really good musicians or really technical or nerdy about gear or whatever, right? Lots of stuff just doesn't translate through the music. But when you kind of have that extra experience, especially if you can see it live, like that can make all the difference. And so that's what's really cool about hearing about these records that, maybe weren't as big or maybe just ones I don't know as much. Because if I just went and listened to it, I would just say, it sounds good to me or it doesn't sound good to me. But I don't have all those other experiences that kind of make me, give a bit more time to it and be like, okay, like I want to listen to this a bit more because, I have this extra information that makes my ear kind of listen a little bit more intently. So that's
exactly
really cool.
But you probably have those records too that remind you of a certain place or a certain time, or you have those memories from a certain record, and you bring that to the record when you listen to it, right? And so you like that record more so because of it. And it's the same thing when you know a band and you kind of grew up with them a little bit and you kind of followed them for a while and you understand what it is that they're doing. That's what I bring to the RX Bandits when I listen to their records.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I love that kind of insight. And the next one is Homegrown Kings of Pop. This was released in 2002. I love this album. We had Adam from the band on the show a few months ago to talk about this album, and awesome dude. This is, one of those bands that, they kind of, it was really poppy. It kind of, the lyrics were a bit kind of more humorous or whatever, but the melodies were so good. It was super catchy. I remember this one specifically because I'd heard, songs from the previous albums on compilations or something. It was like, okay, it's okay. And then this album came out and it was just seemed like it was so far above what the rest of the albums they'd released. And so I was instantly a fan, and I was a bit sad in that I think this was the last full length that they released on Drive-Thru. But let's hear your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, so Homegrown, man, those guys. So I think if I say that the RX Bandits were the band that I appreciated the most, and appreciated their music the most, Homegrown was the band that I liked the most, like as people. In the band that we got along with the best. From the minute that we met those guys, the first time we ever met them was actually in Japan. We got offered to do a tour, like a 6 or 7 day tour in Japan with those guys, like in 2001, I want to say, or maybe it was early 2002. And from the minute that we met those guys, we were like super good friends. You know,
Yeah.
it's like it just clicked. We just thought about things the same. You know, we just kind of went about our business the same way, and it was just so much fun. And we did a lot of touring with them afterwards too. We played a lot of shows. We ended up stealing their guitar tech and stealing their merch guy and stealing their sound guy. And so they all came and toured with us after, you know, Homegrown stopped touring for a while. So we just kind of picked up with those guys.
Yeah, awesome.
So we had that connection with them too. I grew up listening to Homegrown, you know, like when I was in high school, I think my senior year in high school was when their first record, That's Business, came out. And I love that record. It was like one of my favorite records. And then what was the one after that? Act Your Age, I think it was called.
Yeah.
I love that record too. And so when I heard that they were signing with Drive-Thru, I was like, fuck, yes, this is amazing. Like I'm going to be label mates with a band that I already know, like their music, and I already love, you know? And it was so cool to be able to meet them and like them after liking their music, you know, because there's always that fear, I think, sometimes when you really like a band and you're a little worried to meet them because you don't want them to be dicks.
Yeah.
You know, and then that just ruins the band for you. But no, I mean, we met Homegrown and they were amazing. And they are still, like every single guy in that band and everyone that worked for them. Like I said, they toured with us for a while. I love all those guys. We still keep in touch every once in a while.
Yeah, right on. What are some of your favorite kind of standout moments on the album, or songs, or is it just kind of aesthetically this album, or is it more the kind of personalities of them and the memories with them?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what it is. I mean, there's a lot of songs on that record I like. I mean, You're Not Alone is a great song. Is Kiss Me Diss Me on that record?
Yeah.
I think it is. I like that song too. You know, there's a bunch of good songs on that record. And it doesn't, it's another one of those records that I don't think there's like a bad song. You know, like I don't really skip over it. I don't feel like I could do without this song.
Right.
You know, it's good from start to finish.
Yeah.
And I love records like that. Even if you don't love every song, like I find these days it's pretty rare to listen to an entire record and not find at least one or two songs that you're like, this sucks. I'm skipping over it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that definitely, you know, attests to a band when they can do that. And so I definitely agree with that. Oh, the last one here is Houston Calls, collection of short stories, released August 2nd, 2005. This is a band I probably know more just from like seeing in magazines. You know, as soon as I see that artwork with the snare drum and paint, it's like, man, I remember seeing this all over. I don't know it as much. I was listening through it again last week and just to kind of get a feel for it. And yeah, it definitely sounds like it's something I could have liked. I think it was just one of those bands that for whatever reason just kind of got lost in the shuffle or whatever. So why does this one stand out to you?
Yeah, this one stands out to me again because, like I said, I'm a huge fan of big hooks and catchy melodies. And this record has all of that.
Yeah.
Like every song has some sort of big catchy hook to it. And we toured with these guys for a little bit too, and they were really cool. They were a lot of fun. They were new. I don't want to say newer, but they were a younger band.
Right.
You know, when we toured with them. And so it was kind of fun to kind of show them the ropes and show them what touring was all about. And so that was pretty cool. I have a lot of good memories about that tour with them. But this record kind of needed to grow on me a little bit. You know, like I saw them live before I heard the record. And I knew a couple of the guys before they were even in this band, just from the days that we would tour in New Jersey. We would stay at people's houses. We used to stay at Jared's house quite a bit, actually. He was in this other band called Face First.
Okay.
And, you know, we used to play with them. They were like a ska band. And so then when Houston Calls formed, you know, we took them out on the road and I saw them live first. And I was like, okay, it's cool. I like some of the songs. But like, you don't always get a feel for songs live unless you're like really zoned in listening to it.
Yeah,
so I kind of would listen to them like peripherally while I was in the dressing room or like changing my guitar strings or whatever. And I was like, oh, that's cool. And then I would listen to the record and I was like, oh, that's a good song. And then I would listen to the record some more and I was like, well, that's a good song too. And well, here's another really good song. And that kept happening. Like I kept listening to these songs over and over again. I was like, wait, that song's actually really good. And so that record really grew on me a lot. And I haven't listened to it actually in a while, so I'm going to go back and do that. But I really like it. It's really, really good. It's, at least in my opinion, it's probably one of the most underrated records that Drive-Thru. Well, technically, I don't know if it actually came out on Drive-Thru. I think it came out on Rushmore. But
Oh,
whatever,
okay.
it's still
Yeah,
it's still Drive-Thru.
yeah.
But I think it's the most underrated record that Drive-Thru ever released.
Wow. Wow, that's a
Yeah.
pretty good
So,
recommendation.
for those listening, if you have not listened to the Houston Calls record, go listen to it because it's really good. I promise you.
Yeah, awesome. Wow, thanks so much for sharing about those 5 albums and
Yeah.
lots of extra stuff in there too. So kind of to wrap up, we were kind of talking about this before we hit record, but kind of what are you doing musically now? If anything, how you kind of staying creative? The last even decade or whatever since Allister called it quits. How are you still involved in music and anything that people can check out?
So Alistair has we just put out a record 2 years ago in 2019. It's kind of almost like a greatest hits
Oh
record.
yeah. Sorry.
And so we released that, and there's actually 4 unreleased. Well, not they're released now, but there were 4 brand new songs on that record. I think there's 20 songs altogether. 16 of them were songs from all of our previous releases. And then there's 4 new ones. And it was fun doing that one because we got to re-record some old songs. Like we re-recorded Somewhere on Fullerton. We re-recorded Radio Player. Some of those older songs. It was kind of neat to re-record and do those. But so Alistair isn't. We're still writing songs and we're still demoing songs, and we're
cool.
hoping to put out another record.
Awesome.
Probably next year, maybe. We do a lot of touring in Japan because for whatever reason we do very well over there.
Yeah, like even still currently.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so we're hoping we can put out a new record at least sometime soon. Once the pandemic is over, we're hoping that we can get back over there with at least a new EP.
Yeah.
Or a new record. And then I also play in another band called Hot Alice that's kind of has a little more of a rock and roll flavor to it, more like a Foo Fighters-ish, kind of punk rock, kind of pop rock, kind of just straight up rock and roll. We put out an EP. It's on Apple Music. It's on Spotify. You can go check it out. It's on Bandcamp.
Awesome. Yeah.
And so I write songs for that band too. I've got just loads of new demos that I'm working through, trying to figure out, song structures and what song would be best for which band. And so we got tons of material. We just need to kind of sort through it and actually, find some time to record and do it.
Yeah.
So
well, that's awesome.
You can definitely look for new music from at least one of the bands that I'm in, either Allister or Hot Alice, at some point, probably in the next year, for sure.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. You're still able to, connect with a group of guys and be creative and put music out. And are you finding that, or maybe like what is inspiring you to still create now, like, compared to 15, 20 years ago? Are you finding that different things are inspiring you to create and make music, in this day and age versus, when you were kind of first going?
I find that I'm listening to more a bigger variety of bands. I think when Allister was touring back in the day, like between 1996 and 2006, I listened to pretty much one type of music. It was like punk rock. It was like the Ramones. It was Screeching Weasel, the Teen Idols, the Queers, like that was the kind of stuff that I loved.
Yeah.
There was other bands that I really liked too, and I would listen to other music. But I think as I get older, I'm really trying to make more of an effort to listen to a wider variety of bands. Whether it's, like country, whether it's electronic dance music, whether it's pop, whether it's, rock, whatever it is, folk music, I'm really trying to get into a lot of different musical genres, just to kind of help, expand the ideas that I can come up with in the songs that I can write.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. That makes me excited to hear what you're working on. And yeah, well, thanks so much, Tim, for taking the time to talk and connect and share about these records. I love getting to hear, stories from guys like you that were there when it was happening. That's really, it adds a whole different dimension of a love for an album, even if it's not my own experience. Even just hearing yours, it's like, oh man, that's really cool. I wonder how that would affect my love for this record if I had those experiences. So
yeah,
I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. So thanks so much.
Yeah. No worries.